I'm Casey Shalapsky, and I help coordinate programs here at Hanson House. So this evening, we're considering an institution that is at the core of the Hanson House mission, the university. A public university such as the University of Minnesota is a public good. It benefits our community as a whole. It's meant to be a space that welcomes people from a wide variety of backgrounds and convictions to pursue the common intellectual tasks that we together deem as valuable. But in the age of the multiversity, where the public university is so large and involved in so many different sectors of society and culture, how do we determine and define our shared educational purposes? In the university, we also face the same challenge of pluralism that we encounter elsewhere in public life. When we disagree in our fundamental convictions and values, how do we still move forward in our common life? Well, tonight's Homer lecture addresses these and related questions. What are the goods that a public university offers, and where do its limits lie? How does a proper recognition of both a university's goods and its limitations make possible the participation of Christians and members of other communities? In what ways does a university benefit the Christian community and other religious communities? And in what ways does the Christian community benefit the university? These are among the questions we want to pursue this evening by exploring one scholar's journey in navigating these very questions. The humanities have often been a place within the university for self-critique, where foundational questions about the nature of education and the purpose of the university can be raised and pursued. So it's fitting that tonight we have a scholar of the humanities leading us in this inquiry into the purposes of the university. I'd like to welcome our guest speaker, Dr. Chad Wellmon, Associate Professor of German Studies at the University of Virginia. Dr. Wellmon holds a PhD from UC Berkeley in German Studies. His scholarship centers on the history of modern universities and academic knowledge, but he's more broadly concerned with how this history shapes our current forms of education and ways of thinking. His writing on the contemporary university has been published in places like the Chronicle of Higher Education. And Dr. Wellmon cares deeply about undergraduate education. He recently chaired the committee at UVA that achieved the first revision of the general education curriculum in the College of Liberal Arts in 40 years. He lives with his family alongside UVA undergraduates as the faculty principal of Brown College, one of UVA's residential colleges. So it is my privilege tonight to welcome Dr. Chad Wellmon to deliver our 23rd annual Homer Lecture.
Good evening. Thank you so much, first of all, to all of you for coming out. You're stuck, and I'm going to tell you why you might be stuck in a minute. Andrew, thank you for the original invitation, Casey, and all of the members of Hanson House for the warm welcome. And I just want to thank you. I think I'm going to thank you. You might not thank me, because I'm going to try. This is a first-person reflection, not a third-person scholarly account, and I'm very comfortable in the latter form. But Andrew promised me that I at least wouldn't be run out by the end of it, should I be too essayistic. Let me get some water. I was never possessed by the certitude my father professed. When I'd hit my younger brother or talk back to my mother, he would stare through me and say, "Can't you hear the Spirit of the Lord?" As he went on, I would stare off, picturing the Spirit as a giant red rotary phone with no numbers, just a handset and a long curly cord, my father's direct line to God. His certain knowledge seemed like a gift, compensation for a life I desperately wanted to avoid. Kids who already had kids, no college degree, no career, just a series of jobs. But it was also something he strove for, constantly preparing himself to be transformed. Before my family could eat dinner, we had to wait for him to put away his Bibles. We ate where he read, scribbled, and prayed, on a long, thin plane of wood he had found and then finished into our family table. His Bibles, King James Bible, the New International Version, the parallel Hebrew Koine Greek English version, and all the books about Bibles, the concordances, the dictionaries, the commentaries. These were the core of our family library, which doubled when my uncle gave my brother and me a set of World Book encyclopedias. Sometimes my father was preparing for a Sunday school lesson in a church, or a lesson on Revelation and the approaching apocalypse just for us in our family's living room. But mostly, he read and prayed like I practiced baseball. I never wanted to read the Bible like my father. The magic that seemed to work on him frightened me. So I read our encyclopedias whose facts consoled me. But I believed what he told me. The book will change you. It will make you whole. And I certainly wanted to be transformed. One day after practice, just a few months into my freshman year in high school, a teammate asked if I had ever read any philosophy. Rick was a junior who commanded our soccer team's back line, including me, with the same serene confidence with which he ambled through the high school halls. The kind that made boys like him into benevolent demigods among mere pubescents. And so, when he handed me a worn-out paperback, I read it. First published in 1926, Will Durant's The Story of Philosophy, The Lives and Opinions of the World's Greatest Philosophers, was a mass-market success, selling over 3 million copies. One of 11 children to French-Canadian immigrants, Durant grew up in North Adams, Massachusetts, before leaving home to train as a Roman Catholic priest, first at St. Peter's College in New Jersey, and then in seminary at Seton Hall. But after reading Spinoza's Ethics, he wrote years later in a memoir, he was never able, quote, to recapture the old piety and the old faith. So he withdrew from seminary and shortly thereafter was excommunicated. I'm not suggesting a causal relationship from withdrawing from seminary and excommunication, but that's all I know from his biography. Maybe there is. Durant moved to New York, and while earning his doctorate in philosophy at Columbia University, he directed the Labor Temple School, an education center where he also taught philosophy to the city's workers. He based his lectures on the canonical figures of Western philosophy, such as Aristotle, Plato, and Locke, and on extensive outlines, which he then published as 5-cent, what he called little blue books. After coming across them, Lincoln Schuster, of publishing giant Simon & Schuster, decided to collect and publish them as The Story of Philosophy in 1926. I'm not going to pretend like I remember any particular passage or argument from that book, but I do remember its cover. This big letter title centered on a white background, a token of a kind of new education. And it wasn't until recently, thinking of my dad who can't read anymore and whose certainty has certainly diminished, that I returned to The Story of Philosophy, wondering why it had held such a power over me. In a preface written years after its initial publication, Durant explained that he thought the modern American public needed his story, and this is how he explained it. Human knowledge, and I'm quoting him here, human knowledge had become unmanageably vast. Every science had begotten a dozen more, each subtler than the rest, and philosophy itself, which had once summoned all sciences to its aid in making a coherent image of the world, had been fragmented. All that remained was the specialist scientist who knew more and more, but about less and less. Facts replaced understanding, and knowledge split into 1,000 isolated fragments. An esoteric class, as he put it, of experts had divided humanist knowledge amongst themselves. Going on, I just love this description, monastically isolated from the world, they jealously lorded over it, dismissing the claims of the uninitiated as the quaint efforts of dilettantes. Against all of this, Durant promised to reclaim literature, philosophy, and thought from specialized academics, from people like me, and to humanize it. Now, today, I can see Durant in relation to other intellectual projects of his time. He gave the new humanism of the early 20th century, from Irving Babbitt to Norman Foster's Humanism in America, a democratic sheen. Modernity, wrote Foster in 1930, is, quote, the problem of unity with ourselves. Modernity is the problem of completeness. And what was needed in its stead was the integration, as he put it, of values, of knowledge, and of human beings. A humanism that transcended any particular politics, religion, or school and resolved humans into an eternal harmony. Like my father tracing the transformations of our bodies in this earth through the book of Revelation, Durant sketched another line of moral ascent through the history of philosophy. But unlike my father's, Durant's was an eschatology for everyone, but also, to this 13-year-old boy, just for me. I used the book as some kind of moral atlas. I read each chapter as one possibility for who I might become. Maybe Socrates, maybe Hume, maybe Nietzsche, maybe Kierkegaard. He cast philosophy not as a set of syllogisms, but as a way of life available to everyone. His philosophers modeled lives that I could claim as my own despite who I was and where I came from. I chose Socrates and Nietzsche, whom Durant had styled as gadflies who question the gods and pieties of those in charge. During my 4 years in college, I continued to read In Search of Redemption. I mean, I can't even get through this without talking about like the vignettes of a cliched movie, right? I mean, just listen to this one. On the vineyard banks of the Rhine, my junior year abroad in Germany, Soren Kierkegaard's retellings of Abraham's faithful willingness to slaughter his son wrenched my religious imagination, formed, fortified, and until then forgotten from its calcified state. Now, I had initially been drawn to philosophy, literature, and then the humanities more generally because they were grounded, or so I thought, in something other than my father's faith. But, as I would realize years later, I had become consumed with the transformation promised by a different faith, the university, and in particular, the humanities. As I finished college then, I thought I had two ways of life to choose between. The piety of my father and the piety of a humanities professor. Now, arguments for the purpose of the humanities, especially those concerned with liberal education in the university, typically rely on anecdotes such as these. People like me justify institutions and their structures, departments and majors and enrollments, and the need of money by personal testimony. And without a common language, shared values and commitments and the idioms to talk about them, individual experiences stand in for a presumed universality. But this hortatory form of public speech has been, I think, rather ineffective when used to make a case for universities as social institutions. There's a gap between the particularities of how I became who I am today and any claim I could make about how philosophy and literature necessarily transforms lives and shapes souls more generally. Perhaps reading Nietzsche as a teenager could change others as well, but even if we were to grant that reading Nietzsche could change a student, wouldn't those of us committed to the health of an institution, not to mention that student, want a clear sense of how, why, and to what end such change could be sustained and guaranteed? This gap between the allure of anecdote and the force of social justifications for institutions crystallizes in public settings like these tonight. So I'm testifying to the truth and worth of the humanities and the university by offering my own story as evidence. Listen to how the humanities liberated a teenager from the foothills and evangelicalism of Western North Carolina. Identify with my narrative of self-improvement and then go give to your alma mater. But herein lies, I'd suggest, both the promise and peril of real education, even universities. We rarely know at the outset the goods that thinking well might provide. The ends of an education in thinking and of the university are often difficult to discern, let alone to articulate when you first began. The goods of an intellectual vocation, even one lived out in the modern university, are only gradually revealed. After college and a year studying in Berlin and marriage, I enrolled in a PhD program in German studies at the University of California, Berkeley, where in my first semester, 2 seminars dejected and disciplined me. One introduced me to the study of literature by not reading any literature. We surfed from Saussure to Butler, but the real lesson that semester was that we had to read any text closely, that to really read was to read syntactically, sentence to sentence, and to relate words to sentences as authoritative, self-sufficient keys with the potential to transform you from a state of humble incomprehension and curiosity to critical clarity and insight. I relished the sense of distance and rigor the seminar cultivated in me. I felt smart, but it also felt very familiar. Literary and philosophical texts, not just the Bible, were precious objects worthy of the devotional practice that reading had always been to me. But all that was short-lived. For our final exam, the professor distributed a single sheet of paper with over 25 different article titles. And upon distributing it, he chuckled that the titles were fake. He had made them up. Our assignment, as he went on to explain, was, based only on the made-up article titles, to hypothesize what theory the author had used and to justify our hypothesis by drawing on our semester's reading. It was ingenious. Professional, disciplined literary study was a game, and I was already really good. Another seminar, this one in intellectual history, offered a different model of smartness, rigor, and reading. In our first meeting, the professor distributed a syllabus with a title of a 200 to 400 page book printed beside the date of each one of our meetings. And we were to have read this book, of course, or so I presumed. So the next week, I brought my copy of Pierre Bourdieu's The Field of Cultural Production, I still remember it, dutifully adorned with marginalia and underlined passages. I had stayed up all Sunday night reading it. And as the discussion began, I raised my hand, opened my book, and turned to a particular passage. But as I started to look around, as I started to speak, I realized that only one other student had his book open. And shortly thereafter, that only a few even had the book out on the seminar table. I'd been trained it turns out at the end of the semester, I'd been trained according to two distinct models of reading. The intellectual historian who reads extensively, skimming hundreds of pages per week in search of big patterns and points of comparison, on the one hand, but on the other hand, the scholar of literature who reads intensively, page by page in anticipation of internal contradictions and structures that will give way to a buried truth. So by the winter break, I no longer expected reading to transform me. And I committed to method, to history, and facts. I did so for practical reasons, to finish school, to get a job, to succeed. But I also did it for therapeutic ones. The university and the discipline compensated, I thought, at least at the time, for what I had lost. Everything I had imagined reading in the life of the mind to be. The university changed me, but in ways I never would have anticipated, from a desperately desirous reader for whom the text was simply a stage for my own personal experience, always private, into a technically skilled reader for whom the text was Bestand. That's a nice German word, but I'll explain it. Material for further use. Material to be used for a seminar paper, the next talk, the dissertation, the first book, and then all the books that follow. That's how you read as a scholar. My closest grad school friends left the academy because, as one of them and my wife said, they like to read. Now, at this point in my testimony, not my confession, it is tempting to indulge in nostalgia and lament the total loss of the desires and faith that I had projected onto literature, philosophy, and the university. But that would be, for me at least, dishonest, ungrateful, and a hopeless stance to take towards a community that I love and an institution that has and continues to, sometimes despite itself, to share its goods with the world and me. I've always read and thought with a focused intensity because I believe I learned to read by watching my father read the Bible. For my father and for me, every page held the promise of revelation. And so we read as though furiously searching for truth, as though it were a material thing deposited between the pages of books, like honey entirely prepared by others. The method, the skill, the technique I acquired in graduate school made me a better reader of Plato and Nietzsche, and I think now they would have made my father a better reader of God's Word. The inverse, of course, of my anecdotal apology for the modern research university and its professionalizing power can be found in a relatively recent genre that might be called quitlit. Largely the effort of scholars and intellectuals roughly my own age. I started at UVA in 2007, just before the Great Recession hit. Quitlit refers to an intensely personal, essayistic form of writing that does about two things, I would say. One, it catalogs the all too familiar harms, horrors, injuries, and injustices experienced by graduate students or young academics or undergraduates. And two, it submits them as a public indictment, not only of their particular professors and administrators, but of an institution that has become wrong. Both the catalog of injury and the public indictment are intended to justify their decision to leave the academy, as well as the exhortation for others to do the same, or at least to think about the institution where they find themselves. And it's just this assertion of personal experience, this assertion of a personal experience into a judgment of an entire institution that crystallizes another feature of the gap that I've been talking about tonight, blurring the distinction between personal lament and institutional critique. And yet, the pathos of dejection, the disappointment when you read these essays and these texts, exposes what I consider to be a constitutive feature of universities, a feature that makes up the modern university, the gap between character and technique, what the Germans would call Bildung, moral formation, and method, moral transformation and knowledge. I went to graduate school not because I wanted to teach and write on European intellectual history and romantic literature as a literature professor. I went because UC Berkeley promised to pay me to read. That's the contract I recall signing in any case. And so it is peculiar, and I think we have to think about this a bit. It's a peculiar and relatively recent development that one institution has come so completely to monopolize the resources, social forms, and moral imaginations of living out an intellectual life and vocation. The modern research university has been the dominant institution of knowledge and the arbiter of authoritative and legitimate knowledge for almost 150 years now. Now, I think that's changing dramatically now, but that's a different story. And that authority and legitimacy rest in part on the logic and ethic of disciplinary expertise and modern society's deferral to that expertise. All that stuff I was talking about, professionalization. Now, of course, this wasn't always the case that universities had a monopoly on this. You can think about the history of monasteries and libraries and courts and cathedral schools, the Republic of Letters, each organizing knowledge by forming lives of those who sustained them. But what we often forget, and what I don't think I understood when I was in graduate school, I certainly didn't understand it when I decided I wanted to go, was that like these earlier institutions of knowledge, the modern research university creates and sustains knowledge by forming people through shared practices in the cultivation of virtues. So those two seminars that I talked about in my first semester, they not only introduced me to method, they also cultivated in my classmates and me common virtues, a commitment to argument, a demand for evidence, an openness to debate, and a commitment to the community of scholars for whom knowledge is not a personal possession, but rather a collective good that must be cultivated, created, and shared across time and space. The university also gave me the bodies of knowledge, the technical know-how, and crucially, and this continues, maybe it's because of where I grew up and because nobody in my family went to college, that I still can't believe I get away with this. What the university really gave me and continues to give me is time to read and think. It's a gift. But also, it gives me this time to read and think not just with the exuberance that I had as a kid, but also with skill, care, and rigor. And to do so every day without waiting for the unreliable gifts of inspiration. The mechanicalness of method. I chose an ugly word because method can be such an ugly idea. The mechanicalness of method and the routinization of reading that I had first felt extinguished my intellectual desire, have gradually come to understand, helped transform my avarice for new experiences, a version perhaps of Augustine's curiositas. into an intrinsically normative intellectual virtue, perhaps a version of his studiositas. The university formed me into an academic discipline, which is not just an abstract category of knowledge, but a community of scholars, a tradition, and a set of practices and the goods and virtues internal to them. Now, this type of disciplined thinking developed in me the capacity to attend to a given object, a text, a concept, an idea, not because it necessarily offered me immediate stimulation or satisfaction, but rather because it focused my energy and effort on the purpose at hand. So I studied, for example, the German literary and philosophical canon, at least as defined by Berkeley's German department, not because I always had dreamed of reading everything from Meister Eckhart to Thomas Mann, but because I wanted a tradition through which and against which to think and talk with others. And every morning when I stood at 6:45 a.m. beside my wife to wait for our buses on San Pablo Avenue, hers to work across the bay in San Francisco, and mine to my table in Cafe Milano, I felt the formative force of habit and the friction of discipline, up until that moment of absorption in my books and notebooks. And then, of course, again, when I just wanted to walk in Berkeley's repetitively perfect weather. There is, I've come to think, a distinct agency in the grinding of mechanicalness. Choosing to heed an intellectual vocation, like choosing to devote oneself to another person in marriage, requires commitment, motivation, and practice. When I left my father to find another way to live, I had only a vague sense of who I might become. I was oblivious to the promise and perils that lay beyond his big piles of books and his search for sacramental certainty. But through graduate school, my first years on the tenure track, writing my first book, teaching according to the academic calendar, his regularity almost liturgical, the routine and the rhythm of reading and writing every morning with my coffee, with my notebook, and my pencil, these are the daily liturgies of an intellectual vocation that the university sustains like no other modern institution. Now, I'm also a faculty member at the University of Virginia, a public university and bureaucratic behemoth in which education and creating and sharing knowledge can seem incidental at best at times. And so I would distinguish between what I call the academy, all the epistemic practices and goods I've just described, and the university, basically everything else, from the development offices and athletic businesses to the sustainability programs and entertainment services. The academy refers to those intellectual practices as I've described them, and they help explain why someone might devote her life to the university and sustain the university's cultural and social legitimacy and authority. Now, as I've come to lead it, the scholarly life has the shape, to echo Max Weber, of an inner worldly asceticism. It's a rational system that helps maintain and organize my life here and now in this world. In this sense, it is the inverse of what he called otherworldly asceticism of monks and hermits who ultimately sought to escape the temptations of the world through practices of self-discipline. Until recently, such an asceticism made a lot of sense to me. It made a certain life possible. I wanted to rationalize and regulate my actions, my behaviors, and my desires, especially those persistent desires for transcendence. On occasion, I felt compelled to renounce just those desires as a price of scholarly practice and the discipline it demanded of me. And it's at those points, I think, when I mistook scholarly work for an end in itself, a form of, rather than a means to, transcendence. But more often than not, my knowledge and felt sense of those desires have made me a willing ascetic. The fevered hope of my evangelical youth that all will be made well in a final act of divine redemption was repeatedly remade and reoriented, but it persists. But it wasn't just the need to constrain eschatological hopes that made the scholarly life so compelling to me. It was also the prosaic plurality of this dappled world, the different ways of knowing, of living, and loving. Leaving the tightly guarded world of my paternal piety, I still wanted to be educated. I wanted to learn. I wanted authority, just of a different sort. Like all practices, however, those of the academy can deform, and their potential to do so is not just incidental, the result of doing it poorly, as opposed to doing it well. Ever since the first research universities were established in Germany in the first 2 decades of the 19th century, critics have documented these deformations in jeremiads that lament academic specialization and the failure of universities to form moral character. This is one thing that is entirely consistent in the 200-year history of the research university. Laments about disciplinary knowledge or specialization, the lack of moral formation. And it goes something like this: university-based knowledge, that is everything I just defended, has nothing to say about morality, questions about purpose, how one ought to live, and why. Modern universities abandon moral formation for specialized knowledge, character formation for technique and method, moral virtue for technical skill. I understand the frustration, but for some reason, I'm trying to make sense of that now, I've never fully shared it. But it was only last fall that I began to understand why my disappointment in what I wanted the university to be has always been outweighed by a gratitude for what it is. On the night of August 11th, 300 torch-wielding white supremacists marched 2 by 2 across my backyard, chanting, "Jews will not replace us." As our children huddled in our darkened house, my wife and I followed the khaki-clad men and women as they marched away from our house, onto the lawn, and up the steps of UVA's famous rotunda. In the days that followed, my university president referred to these men and women as, quote, torch-bearing protesters. And none of her statements over the weekend, the Saturday and Sunday that followed, did she name the particular ideology, white supremacy, or express the moral outrage so palpable across campus and in Charlottesville. So by the following Monday morning, I had concluded, as I wrote in an essay that was published that afternoon, that contemporary universities were, as I put it, incapable of moral clarity. I just expected too much. And here, quoting from that essay, is it okay? I mean, it's really obnoxious to quote from yourself. But I'm going to say that I was wrong, so it's okay. So this is what I wrote. Why should my colleagues and I look to our chief executive for moral leadership? As the university president, Teresa Sullivan is, in the words of Thorstein Veblen, a captain of erudition, not the leader of a community bound to a common moral mission. In the year that has passed since I wrote that, I realized that I was wrong. I should have expected more from my president, but not what I wanted that weekend of August 11th and 12th. Universities are distinguished by epistemic ideals and practices worth defending. They're bulwarks of trustworthy knowledge in a cultural and media environment whose most precious but most manipulated resource is attention. But that authority and legitimacy does not depend upon a comprehensive and common moral mission. There is no necessary relationship between scholarly practice and moral transformation. Well beyond graduate school, I assumed that my work as a scholar in the university ought to integrate my various roles and identities: father, husband, neighbor, citizen, confessing Christian. To do otherwise would have been to acknowledge the loss of a certain faith. But after last August in Charlottesville, I realized that I had redirected many of my hopes for wholeness, for integration, and redemption onto an institution that could not possibly bear them. The university had become, for me, as for many others, I would say, a sacred institution. And this implicit sacralization of the university has led many of my colleagues in particular to conclude that universities ought to directly impart value, worth, moral claims. On this analogy, as Amanda Anderson writes, going to class is analogous to going to church. It's where professors make students sympathetic, democratic, or whatever other virtues they extol. And when professors fail to deliver more moral students, everybody's upset and everybody blames the university. It was this expectation that drew me to the humanities and made me, and then in graduate school, I found so initially defeating. I'd come to believe that my two options, as I said earlier, were the piety of my father or the piety of the university. We can hear this piety of the university, this expectation, this projection of piety, in what I call humanities talk. Just consider a few recent examples just from the past few months. These are all quotations about these talks that try to defend or define the humanities. We consistently and necessarily turn to the humanities and arts for answers for healing and for resolution in the most difficult and trying times. The humanities are a secular version of human being and human flourishing. The task of the humanities is cultural psychoanalysis. That's actually my favorite. The humanities are where we locate our own lives, our own meanings. We need the advanced study of the humanities so that we might someday become advanced human beings. Since joining the faculty 10 years ago at UVA, I've increasingly been asked to justify the humanities in reports, memos, emails, and talks. And I found myself tempted to make such claims that I felt eventually sounded more like wishes. I suggested that the humanities satisfied all sorts of social needs, but I couldn't rid myself of the nagging sense that I was defending them in a morally tinged language that far outstripped their capacity to deliver on their promises I was making, or at least the promises I experienced them in the classroom. I wanted to believe all the things I asserted that the humanities did: make our students better people, sustain democracies, cultivate critical reflection, but couldn't deny the gap between my assertions and what I actually did as I taught and wrote every day. And these claims highlight the gap between what I or others assert the humanities and what the humanities and the university can do and what I think they actually can do in light of my work. Humanities Talk exhorts its audience to appeal to humanities not only as a resource for knowledge, but as therapies for a cultured elite coping with the feeling of disenchantment or dehumanization, as moral compensation for the ills of modernity, making up for modern science, technology, capitalism, and then they tie them both, their form and their function, to one institution, the modern university. So it's not that I can't give an account of why I've devoted my life to the university and to the humanities in particular. It's just that mine is different. From a social perspective, I remain committed to the university because of its importance as an epistemic authority. At its best, the university sustains an intellectual vocation largely impossible in our capital-ordered world and cultivates an intellectual disposition and comportment for living amidst its plurality. As an institution as a whole, the university ought to defend its knowledge practices, its values and norms, the virtues that I talked about earlier, its commitment to evidence, openness to debate and argument, intellectual generosity, intellectual integrity, and confidence in its internal goods and aware of its moral limitations. The university can form people who think well, who value knowledge, and are capable of reflecting on their own deepest commitments, as well as those of others with care, humility, and generosity. It can help students better reflect on and articulate their own deepest commitments and how they might best realize them. It can help them achieve a certain bit of clarity. This, I would argue, is rather different from the supposed value neutrality typically attributed to the modern university, and rightfully dismissed as morally impossible and epistemologically suspect. But as a whole, universities never provide students, and they never have, with comprehensive doctrines or ready-made answers to life's most meaningful questions. They are not the bearer of our most fundamental or inscrutable values. Their goods are proximate, not ultimate. And with this more chastened sense of its ends, I think we can more clearly and vigorously defend what the goods that the university can offer, something like trustworthy knowledge. But it can also help those of us in and around universities, whatever our confession, to acknowledge that we bring our deepest commitments and loves with us the minute we step on a campus or into a classroom. And so, in conclusion, I don't bemoan the fact that the university and university teaching do not fulfill what my father, perhaps an earlier version of myself, or the humanities talk folks wanted to. But I can commit to the epistemic practices and virtues that are the proper job of the university, and I can do it in a spirit of love. Thank you.